Welcome to this special edition of Sonshine's Table Talk, the Voice Referendum. Joining me for the conversation is Martin Smith from the Ebenezer Aboriginal Corporation, who is representing the Yes Vote campaign, and representing the No Vote campaign is Trish Botha from Fair Australia. This referendum has seen so much division, with a lot of passion around both the yes and no votes. So today we want to stay away from debate. Each guest will be asked the same questions and given 2 minutes to respond to each one. And to wrap up the conversation, we're also going to be joined by Executive Chairman from HHG Legal Group, Simon Creek, to talk specifically about the constitutional change. So let's dive in. Joining me now is Martin Smith from Ebenezer Aboriginal Corporation. Martin, thank you so much for joining me as part of this conversation today. And to get us started, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and what side of the conversation you sort of sit on?
Yep. So, look, absolutely delighted to be here. I think it's always good for us to start with an acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge the Whadjuk people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters where we gather today. Certainly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And just so you know, I'm Noongar from the Great Southern of Western Australia. I belong to the Noongar Nation. I'm a descendant of the Menang people down in the area where the Stirling Ranges are. And when I look back, I know that I have a responsibility to be able to represent my people and share my knowledge with with others as well. So certainly delighted to be here, and I have connections to the Whadjuk people as well. And like I said, it is a privilege to be able to come and share with you this afternoon. I'm a registered minister. I've been part of the Aboriginal Church now for about 30 odd years. I'm an elder in the Balga Evangelical Aboriginal Church, and I'm also the current CEO of Ebenezer Aboriginal Corporation. So I bring all of those hats today. That's why I most probably haven't got much hair, because I'm changing the hats all the time. But it is really good to be here and to have a discussion around the voice. And I'm certainly a supporter of the voice. And what I do know is that there's an opportunity for us to be able to unite Australia, and I think the voice has the capacity to be able to do that.
And so, are you on the yes or no side of the conversation?
Yeah, I'm on the yes.
Yeah.
So yes, certainly support the referendum, and certainly hope that it does get over the line, because I think it can make a significant difference at a community level.
Absolutely. Joining me now is Trish Botha from Fair Australia. Welcome to Table Talk, Trish.
Thank you, Leah.
Now, tell us a little bit more about who you are and your background, and what side of the campaign that you sit on.
Sure. So look, I was contacted to come down and chat with you guys today. I'm really passionate about the campaign because I know how it affects so many people who need the real assistance. So I'm based out in the regions predominantly doing community economic development work. I'm part Aboriginal Islander, so for me it's a personal conversation, and I think it's such a weighty conversation that we need to have some intelligent consideration around it. I know it's become heightened and emotional, and that's certainly been my case at times too, but I have considered it long and hard. And I've arrived at the no campaign, at the no side of the vote.
Let's start with our questions. And
Yep.
The first one, you sort of touched on this already, but from your perspective, tell me more about what this constitutional change will mean for you as you see it.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying a little bit earlier, I think that when you look back at history, there is Aboriginal people, and I'll talk Noongar people, were really excluded from a whole range of different things. So if you go back and look at the metropolitan area, there was a restricted area that Noongars weren't allowed in after a certain time frame. And when I look back over my own history, and I look back and see some of the things that I now have a privilege to be involved in, because the work was done pre me getting there, but certainly understand that it has been a real fight and a struggle for Noongar people and Aboriginal people and Indigenous people right across Australia. So when you think about this opportunity, an old mate of mine would say something like this. He said, it's better to have 10% of something than 100% of nothing. So this gives us an opportunity to be able to certainly advise government on what's needed at a community level.
Yeah, okay. All right, so Trish, from your perspective, tell me about what this constitutional change means for you and the people that you have been speaking to.
Sure. Look, I am no constitutional lawyer, but what I can say is that I believe that our current constitution has served us well as a nation. People come here from every single country across the planet to live here because of its safety, its security, its capacity for opportunity. Our country really is multicultural. It just so happens that the Aboriginal people were here first. However, according to the human rights figures, I think I brought them here with me today, 72% of our nation is made up of European people, 23% are non-European, that's Asian and African, and 3% are Aboriginal. So for the most part, and most of this country's history, it has been available for everybody to have a fair go. And so changing the constitution, for me, I just don't see the benefit. Yeah, because I think most people who come here, migrants, would argue that they've had a great life in this country.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So our next question then is about something that's popped up a lot in conversation, and that's been about the Voice Advisory Body itself. What's your stance around the body, and what do you feel like are the pros and cons as you see them?
Oh, look, I haven't directly gone into answering like both sides of it, but what I do see is that there's certainly an opportunity for Aboriginal people to be represented right across Australia. So, the pros would be that you'd have representation from all of the groups. So if you take Western Australia, then it'd be the Kimberley, the Pilbara, Metro, certainly the Great Southern area as well. So how that is broken up, I don't know, and none of us do at this stage. But what I do know, it does give us an opportunity to be able to talk to the issues in those regions. So I was listening to Barnaby Joyce and Tanya. I don't know if you've seen that interview on Sunrise, but I found it quite fascinating. And I thought, when I looked at it, they're having a discussion around the Constitution and the change. And Tanya just said this. She said, when they agreed that there would be a defence force in the Constitution, they didn't actually break it down. There'd be that many planes, that many jets and submarines and whatnot. So we'll see where it goes once it gets through.
Okay. So then the next big question that has been popping up around the referendum has been the Voice Advisory Body itself. Can you talk to me about your stance around the body and what are the pros or cons as you see them?
Yeah, look, so the current Indigenous department in Canberra and across the country has about 1,400 employees. I would argue that we would need to go down and have a look at that department instead of bringing in another 24 people. This costs the taxpayer. If we just took it to the bottom line about money, I, as a taxpayer, look at it and go, branch and root analysis of the department and find out what that 1,400 people are doing and which of those projects that are being funded currently are actually getting value for money and are changing the lives of the people that it's supposedly helping. Not to mention that the Indigenous community technically or theoretically receive about 20% of the country's budget. That's about $40 billion a year.
Yeah, okay.
Where's that money going?
Yeah.
I absolutely understand a lot of those projects out there, and it's actually not even touching the sides or getting to the people that the money is supposed to help. I think what is another 22 people going to do in Canberra, sitting in a back room being paid exorbitant amounts of money? I can speak. I don't need them to speak for me.
The department that you're talking about, is that the one that I've listed here? The
NIAA.
Yeah,
That's
great.
them.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned it just then, the other departmental body, and this has been mentioned as well, that there is already an advisory body to the government in place, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, and it was established by an executive order signed by the Governor-General on the 29th of May in 2019. So it has been around for a few years. And for those of you who don't know what the body does, the executive order gives the NIAA several functions, including to lead and coordinate Commonwealth policy development, program design and implementation, and service delivery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It provides advice to the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Australians on whole of government priorities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to lead and coordinate the development and implementation of Australia's Closing the Gap targets in partnership with Indigenous Australians, and to lead the Commonwealth activities to promote reconciliation. So you've touched on this a little bit already, but is there anything else that you would like to add, that you would see that the Voice body is trying to be different than these points, or are they the same in your? How do you see that as you hear those sort of being read out?
Yeah, look, I think the question is self-evident. The Australian people are already paying north of $17 billion a year for that particular part of government and its purpose. If it's not working, why are we not just doing a thorough review of that group instead of just overlaying it with potentially another broken system? Nobody would do that. To me, it's akin to finding that hairline crack in the wall, and just slapping it with another coat of paint instead of putting the putty in and fixing that. There's obviously a problem within and I call it the Indigenous industry, because there are a lot of people out there playing in that industry who are not necessarily doing it for the right reasons. Go and do a thorough review of that. And I think what the Voice and this whole process has done is it's enabled the Australian community to have a closer look at that and not feel embarrassed about asking those questions. And hopefully we can actually get a working model, but I don't believe the Voice is that model.
Okay. And I suppose the next follow-on from that around the Voice advisory body is that people mentioning that there's already an advisory body to the government in place, so the National Indigenous Australian Agency. Can you talk to me about how it's different to the Voice body, and why is it or is it not important then to have something that's different?
Oh, look, I haven't done all of the research, but what we do know is that there's lots of advisory bodies already established. NIAA, we're actually funded. Ebenezer Aboriginal Corporation is funded by them.
Okay.
So we're familiar with NIAA, but understand this: NIAA is a government body, and that's not community led. That's not empowering. That they empower through funding, but it's not through leadership. So when you look at the body really is designed about certainly getting the voice of the people at the community level heard at that national level. So when you take that into consideration, there's certainly a massive difference. And when I as I researched this topic and had a little look at it, I thought, well, what are some of the other really big bodies that advise government at the moment? And I found the Coalition of Peaks, and they certainly, I think they represent 80 odd ACOs. So an ACO is an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, and they have something like about 10,000 members. So when you think about alignment, the Coalition of Peaks would certainly be more aligned than what NIAA is. And that's not saying that NIAA don't do a fantastic job. They do. And they fund us as an Aboriginal organisation, and they've allowed us to certainly have an impact at a community level where we've created change, because what we do know is that Aboriginal people are challenged. And as I was thinking about what I was going to share with you today, if you wanted a really good boomerang, you'd go to the best boomerang maker, wouldn't you? And whatever it is, you'd actually seek advice from that boomerang maker. If you could get advice from him rather than getting advice from other people who think they know about boomerangs, then I think that, you know, we've got an opportunity to go straight to the people rather than any in-betweens. Yeah. Whereas the voice will be community-led and inclusive of community, and that empowers community, because what we do know is that young people, it's a really interesting time for Aboriginal people at the moment, because I've come through the era, you know, I was born in the 60s, and as I look at the 60s and the 70s, they're really difficult times for Noongars. So Noongars were on reserves, and then they moved from reserves and they moved into town, and that caused conflict. So, you know, trying to get people into schools, you know, some people were excluded from schools. But when I look back over the history now, I see that there's some people like Charles Perkins and others that have done some fantastic things to create change. The voice gives us an opportunity to create change, and I think to make Australia a lot better.
And you've mentioned a few times about having the voice body will have representatives from everywhere rather than actual people in community. But I suppose there has also been some questions about how will they be elected, and how will that ensure that, you know, those living in extremely remote areas of Australia will be represented. Is there much that you can speak to in that? I know you mentioned before about we don't know all the nitty-gritties of how it will unfold, but ensuring that there is equal representation across all the different groups that are in Australia.
Well, I'm sure the goal would be to make sure that it is equal representation. And that means leaders that are elected from those areas. They'll be the spokespeople, and they'll be the people carrying the message from the communities. So that, you know, in some sense, that already occurs when you look at certainly where I'm from, the Wawal Kep Corporation as well, the Wajak Corporation, they elect people into, you know, as members of their cultural committees, and also, you know, their boards as well. So that election will be, I'd say, something similar. And, you know, you'd certainly want people, because when we make decisions as Noongars, there's a whole lot of levels of accountability. Yeah. So we can make some decisions, but ultimately we're accountable to community as well. Yeah. So when we do stuff and put stuff in place, then we need to ensure that we have consulted, and that, like I said earlier, that it is community led and inclusive of community views, because if it's not, then we need to be able to put on bulletproof vests. Yes, because at some point it's going to come back at us as well. So you know, when I think about what we do as an organisation, we are, you know, we're accountable to. I'm accountable to my board, to my staff, and to my community, but also, you know, we're accountable to the Balga Evangelical Aboriginal Church with the work that we do as well. So that alignment certainly builds in accountability in a whole lot of levels. So making sure that we are doing the right thing, because we are funded. And when you think about our funding, we've got KPIs to meet. We've got reports that need to be written to ensure that we're actually doing the work that we've signed up to do. So I don't see that would be much different to that.
Yeah, okay. So something else that has been brought up a lot is what happens afterwards. So if the voice succeeds, how will people be elected for the body, for example? And with so many different mobs in Australia, how do you decide which people will be allowed to a say, and then will those be who are living in remote, you know, in regional areas of Australia be represented and given a voice?
Yeah, look, that is probably one of my major concerns. I know one of the ladies who's helped write the Voice 300-page document, and my simple question to her was, will this assist the women out in the bush that I work with, who I currently have to buy underwear and groceries for? Will it help them? And she couldn't categorically give me an answer. So the number of Aboriginal people that I've met throughout the regions and out in the remote areas, most of them don't know anything about the voice. They know nothing about it. That is, they have no information on it, nor do they understand what it's about. And the few people that I've spoken to that do understand it, the Aboriginal people, of which that's where I spend most of my time, do not agree with it, because they are simply wanting to get on with their lives. They want economic stability and development in their own lives so that they can look after their families and be an Australian. They're not these activists that we keep hearing from. So I guess to me that voice combination, it's sounding awfully like a third chamber of Parliament, and the selection process that you speak of would need to be done fairly, and I just don't know how that could be done outside of an election process.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, fair enough. So then, I suppose, where to from here? It's a big question. What, in your opinion, can you see happening if, say, the yes vote does succeed, and then likewise if the no vote succeeds?
Yeah, I'm one of those people that when I commit to a side, I don't like to think of the potential consequences. So for me, the truth is, I don't even want to imagine how bad it will be. I think our country will be divided, because I think there will be the microphone will be given to a small group of people who will be pushing for things that will not necessarily unite our nation. That's my real concern. If the no vote succeeds, the process has begun a national conversation, as I mentioned earlier, around the fact that 3% aren't doing so well, and it is 3% of the country, despite the billions of dollars. And I would like to think that it could, particularly when I think of, when I look at the Labor and Liberal Party, I know this isn't purely political, but the Liberal Party, as an example, have come out publicly and said no. I would love to see them stand up and say, well, on the basis of our support for the no, we've got some ideas. We're not hearing any ideas, but I think it can't just be put to bed there. It's not working. Let's start reviewing as a start, look at closing the gap targets and their figures, and start seeing which of those programs that are being funded aren't working.
Find some solutions.
Find solutions.
Yeah. But in your opinion, what can you see happening if the yes vote succeeds? And then in reverse, what could you sort of see happening if the no vote succeeds?
Yeah. Well, what I think that, I think that when we think about whether the yes vote succeeds, and when I talk to people, what I hear is I hear the excitement in their voices. So I went along to a gathering 2 weeks ago, and Noel Pearson came and spoke at that gathering. But when you see the excitement in the people, because they know that this can create change for them, and opportunities that once weren't there. So certainly believe that the voice is going to be an opportunity for us to hear the voices of people at that community level. So imagine this. Last night, as I was doing my research, I came across Ken White talking, and Ken White said this. He said, as we know that he was the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and he explained. He said this: politicians in Canberra don't have the answers. Because if they did, then when you look at what's occurring now around closing the gap, you'd have to say that we're not doing quite well in that space. So what I do know is that, and someone once said this to me, the smartest brain in the room is not smarter than everyone in the room. So we need to be able to listen to everyone in the room, and then what we do know is that people have been heard. And when I look back at history, you'd see that Aboriginal people, particularly my people down in the Great Southern, didn't get an opportunity to be heard. Sometimes I sit in a restaurant and I go, "This is great food," but I know that my old people never had access to those restaurants. They didn't have access to a lot of the things that I have the privilege to, walk in places, interact in places where my old people didn't have that opportunity.
Yeah. And just to close our conversation today, Martin, I'd love to know if you have anything else you would like to share with our listeners and viewers on this conversation about the Voice Referendum.
Yeah. One thing I do want to say is that when you study the stats and go back over the history, you'd say that Aboriginal people, things have improved and they're getting better, but we still got a lot of work that needs to be done. And I was looking at some stats this morning. When you think about health, education, employment, incarceration, we're not doing well in any of those areas. We are making improvements, but we actually work in the prison space. And what I've found is that, think of this, Indigenous youth are 25 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous youth. That's saying something, isn't it? And then you think about that they're 14 times more likely to end up in prison if they don't complete education. One of the saddest things that I've seen in the work that I do, and we're going to one of the biggest prisons in the metropolitan area, and that is to see three generations of a family in one prison.
Yeah, wow.
You know, and I think that we've got an opportunity as a community and as a nation to try and improve some of those things. And I believe that as a church and as Christians, we're going to be held accountable for some of this. So, you know, we also need to be able to say the work that I'm doing is that, yes, we can get rich and we can fill up our houses and do all the things that we need to do, but what about people that are less fortunate than us? And the Good Samaritan is a good story. And there's lots of opportunities for us to be able to share our knowledge and our wisdom and understanding to improve the lives of individuals out in our community. The church gives us that. And what we do know is the love of the Lord is able to be, if that's shed abroad in our hearts, then that flows out into community, because we can't contain that. And when people are touched by God, what I do see is I see change. And they don't need to go to psychologists or counsellors or what, because I know the Lord can go deeper and do a lot more work in those areas than many can. And we're thankful of that. I'm certainly a strong supporter of the yes vote. And you know, you said, well, what happens after? Well, I do know that, again, listening to Dutton and Plebiscite the other day and hearing what they said this referendum has cost. Do you know how much it's cost?
That's a lot.
It's like they said 450 million.
Yeah.
So 450 million, and what Tanya was also saying was, as she was talking to Barnaby Joyce on it, is that Dutton actually agrees that Aboriginal people need to be recognised. So if it doesn't get over the line, at some point he's going to be pushing that as well. He's not in favour of the voice. So in one camp she's saying that he is in favour, then he's not. But you know, certainly the recognition of Aboriginal people and Indigenous people in the Constitution is, you know, certainly needed.
Well, Martin, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and for sharing as well. Really appreciate having you on Sunshine's Table Talk this morning.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Thanks. Just to close, Trish, I'd love to know if there's any other thoughts that you'd love to share with our listeners and our viewers about this, a very, very big but important conversation.
Yeah. Look, to the listeners out there, I think many of you will tune in because this station is based on having a faith, and I believe that's probably the answer for our nation, and it's certainly the answer for many of the Aboriginal community members that I speak to. They all recognise that this is bigger than them, this decision. But what it has done, it's caused a lot of them to start asking questions around what their value system is. And they have told me categorically, the people out in the remote areas, that they believe in the one true God. And they believe that he is the one that should be leading our nation, and they want to be a part of that. So they're not about payback, but they're actually about living a life in a way that I think is God-honouring, and I think that's the best outcome that we could get for our nation.
It's beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining me on Table Talk this morning, Trish. I really appreciate your time, your insights, and hopefully providing more information and education to all of our listeners and viewers. So thanks for joining me, Trish.
Thanks, Leah. It's been a pleasure.
So joining me now to talk specifically about this constitutional change is Executive Chairman from HHG Legal Group, Simon Creek. Welcome, Simon.
Good to be here.
So Simon, to start, can you explain more about the Constitution? Is it a difficult document to amend, and what are sort of the legal ramifications if a change is made moving forward?
Sure. I think it's the opening question. You've nailed it. In short, amending the Constitution is about as difficult as any legal mechanism in the country in our history. For good reason, given that it effectively is the overriding body of law and guidance to our courts at the end of the day. So this is how hard it is in practice.
Okay.
You've got to have a majority of voters in a majority of states. Now that excludes the ACT and the Northern Territory.
Okay.
And then you've got to have a national majority overall.
Right.
All of that has to be met for the yes vote to get up on the 14th. So big and very difficult obstacle for good reason.
Yeah.
Given that, and leading to the second part of your question really, given that once those changes are made, they are very hard to reverse. We'll get into that. But I think perhaps the best example of how hard it is to make a change to the Constitution is in historical statistics. So, in the past, current and past governments, whenever they've sought constitutional change, have come up with an 18% success rate.
Right.
So out of the 44 national referenda, we've only had 8 succeed.
Wow. That's very small. Yeah,
It is. And again, for good reason in some senses, in that it's as critical and as important a vote any Australian can cast.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we are looking at then, say, if it changes one way, can we then go back and change it, in 10, 20 years, or if it plays out not maybe as we have hoped?
Perhaps this is the even more important question. It certainly adds gravity to what's happening in that technically, yes, but only by going back to the same scenario again, that same complex majority vote. And so really, in practice, the answer is no.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened ever in the past. We've never had a constitutional change by referendum that has then been reversed, effectively because it's not up to the government of the day. And as the Albanese government is finding now, it's one thing to support and put up a vote. It's another thing to persuade not just Parliament and the two houses, but the whole of Australia on that very strict majority vote. So yeah, I guess the short answer is no.
Okay.
So that's why this vote is so important. One way or the other, whatever the outcome, I just hope all Australians realise that this is a very big deal.
For people who may not fully understand sort of the weight behind a change like this, you mentioned some other constitutional changes that have gone through. Is there an example that you could give us to sort of give us a little bit more context of the weight and what it might mean in an example that's gone before?
Sure. I mean, I think historically and certainly relevant to the Voice as an attempt to improve the lot of our Aboriginal Australians. Perhaps the best example is the 1967 introduction of, let's just call it, a much, much better deal for Aboriginal people from what was before.
Sure.
But I reckon the most relevant modern day example of the power of the Constitution at the end of the day relates to, we might all cast our memories back about 6 years, I think, to when roughly a dozen, it might have been 15 members of federal parliament were effectively sacked, disqualified from holding their seats because of Section 44 of the Constitution, which says, I'll read it, any person who is under any acknowledgement of allegiance, obedience or adherence to a foreign power can't be one of our elected. And so we had sitting elected Australian federal politicians removed.
Yes.
They'd forgotten that they were dual citizens or had other interference with that particular overriding provision of the Constitution. Now, the gravity of it is perhaps explained further in that it didn't matter and can't matter if all of Parliament, even both sides of the House, supported them staying. Not enough.
Yeah, okay.
It's not something that can be overruled or tampered with by even the Prime Minister.
Yeah, okay, great. So that really does clarify some of the weight. And I remember when that happened as well. Everyone was a little bit like, what?
Yeah, it was a big surprise to all of us.
Big surprise, absolutely. And that works well as well with my next question about obviously, even if, yes, like the Prime Minister wanted to keep someone to stay with that change, they couldn't. So then in terms of a referendum, how does that differ to, say, an election? You mentioned already the way the weighting has to work out with the states and that sort of thing earlier. Is there anything else that's an important point of difference? Because I think sometimes you might just think, oh, well, why do we do these big, and why is it called a referendum and all that sort of thing?
Yeah. Two big points, I think. I reckon most Australians, or many, are somewhat confused by our state and federal elections every 3 or 4 years, in that it's not a simple majority outcome. All of that preferential voting comes into play, and we're all sitting there going, well, how is this person winning when they've not got a clear majority, etc. So that's a big difference. This is the most stark example of a clear national majority of voters needed.
Yes.
Not just the majority of Australians, as we said, but the majority in a majority of states as well. That's point one. That makes it very different. The second one is quite simply that perhaps it's the slight sceptic in me, but we do know that if we as a country get it wrong at a state or federal election, at worst, we've got to put up with them for 3 or 4 years and we can vote them out.
Yes, yeah.
You can't even think like that, even remotely, about the outcome of a referendum. Once it's done, in effect.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important to remember, and also probably then links with a final question that I've got, because people really need to take the onus on to do some research, and that's what we're hoping to provide with our conversation today. But is there anywhere else, other people that are highly regarded that have written papers perhaps where people can go if they do want to do further research on this topic before they go and vote on the 14th?
Yes, but it has been quite the ordeal.
Yes.
Being able to
find,
for my own benefit and for the firm's benefit generally, to find or to narrow it down to 2 papers, one for each side, that I would recommend everybody read in Western Australia. Look, as you'd expect, lawyers have to get across the detail of this to a very high degree, not to get involved in the debate. Personally, I think too many lawyers have become a little partisan about it. But at the end of the day, to be able to explain to people how this works, what it means, what it might mean in the future. And so, having said that, it's also been useful, important, I think it is for all of us, to look carefully at both sides, yes and no. And so, these 2 papers, both West Australian authors, 2 of our leading legal minds perhaps ever, Robert French, former High Court judge, and Malcolm McCusker, KC, our former governor, both of them brilliant lawyers. Both of them, even though Mr McCusker says he's not in his paper really telling anyone how he's going to vote, it's being called, I think fairly reasonably, an explanation of the no case.
Sure.
And Robert French explains why he believes the yes vote should get up. Those 2 papers, you can easily find them by Googling them. And the French paper, The Voice, A Step Forward for Australian Nationhood, and the McCusker paper, both of them speeches converted into papers, Altering the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, Easier Said Than Done. Okay. So those 2 papers, I reckon everyone should read them. They're about 15 pages long. Believe it or not, they're actually fairly plain English.
Yeah.
They're not a bad read.
Yeah, great. Okay. And we can put the links on our website as well. If you do want to find them, we'll have them there. But Simon, thank you so much for joining me to explain
Pleasure.
this constitutional side, the nitty gritty and my brain kind of boggles a little bit, but I appreciate you unpacking it with me today.
No problem at all.
Thank you.